So hopefully you've all seen the program and you know what this session's about, so I'm not going to recap that. I will quickly introduce everybody though, just in case. I'm Tom from the Copim project, one of the co-leads working on the Opening the Future revenue model, which is about finding funding to fund new open access frontlist books. I'll just introduce you all, if that's all right. This is Baier from Central European University Press, with whom we've been working for the last 5 years on the project. Hopkins, who is my second in command on the Opening the Future project. And above us all, in many ways, is Barr, previously at the University of Sheffield and now head of collections, I believe, at Manchester Met. Is that correct?
Yeah, broadly.
Broadly. Okay, thank you. So we've got university speaker, oh, Elizabeth's not hearing anything. I'm going to leave our tech people to look into that. Kat can hear. Okay, thanks for all of you jumping on the chat to say you can hear, so we'll get Elizabeth sorted. So, yeah, I want to recap the blurb of this session. We're going to try and get a university press perspective and a library perspective on various aspects of collective funding. We'd quite like to just raise some talking points amongst you all, so please do get in the chat, do raise your hands if you've got questions. We want this to be very discursive. We've chosen actually none of us to use slides. We're going to just kind of have an extended Q&A kind of session, so we do want you all to join in with that Q&A. If I could just ask anyone to put their hand up to get the mic, if they could introduce themselves, say where they're from, and speak up so that everyone can hear them, that'd be great, thank you. So, I'll start with a few questions to seed things, and then we'll see where we go from there. So, Kira, I'm going to direct my first question to you, and then if Pete and Kat have points to jump in, please do. So, as we noted in our blurb, when Copim began modelling collective OA books programs back in 2020, there were actually only a handful of publishers pioneering this sort of approach back then. Notably, Open Book Publishers in the UK and Punctum Books in the States. And I always like to give an honourable mention to our colleagues on the Open Library of Humanities in the journal space who were doing this long before many of us, and also to our colleagues at OAPEN who were doing this long before many of us in the infrastructure space as well. But really that was kind of it back in 2020. Yeah. Now since then, and I'll leave you all to draw your own conclusions on whether there was a chicken and egg thing here, but since then, we've seen collective models proliferate from lots of different types of publishers, many of them quite large. Bloomsbury Academic, MIT Press, Michigan, University of Michigan Publishing, Taylor and Francis, and even De Gruyter have a collective funding model. So, I was going to give you a question, Kira, I beg your pardon. They were much larger players than the early pioneers. So my question to you is, do you think that means it's got easier? And what barriers are there now for a press wanting to set up a new collectively funded open access model today?
Firstly, can people hear me? Just checking that the microphone is... Oh, it was muted. Hopefully... Oh, yep, that's a bit better. So firstly, I'm going to start with a slight monologue answer. I'm sorry about that. It will be more dynamic afterwards. But I wanted to talk about some of the experiences that Tom and I have had in the past few years. 2 years for me, like 5 for you at this point. As people who implement a collective funding model, who aren't either publishers or libraries, but at that sort of nebulous middle place, sort of facilitating, because we have some experience that we think are quite useful for others interested in collective funding. I guess, first of all, it's important to say that from some perspectives, participating in collective funding has got a lot easier. I'm thinking specifically of the perspective of authors, because as Tom mentioned, there are so many more publishers engaging in collective funding schemes now that from an author perspective, it's probably much easier to find a pot of collective funding at a publisher that you can use, because as the publishers have expanded, so have the subject areas. However, that doesn't really answer the question. And in fact, I think Tom would probably agree with me that barriers are still a huge issue and have in some ways become worse than they were a few years ago, specifically because of all of this proliferation. It's become a very crowded field, whereas, yeah, at one time there were a very small number of publishers who were doing this very innovative thing. There's quite a few now, And we're competing for budgets that, despite the heroic efforts that we heard about this morning, have not increased necessarily a huge amount, probably haven't increased in line with the number of publishers who are trying to access those budgets. And so, yeah, the growth of the field has in some ways been quite difficult, particularly in that competitive way. But there are two other areas of problems or difficulties, problems to be solved, that we'd like to bring out. One of them is a consequence of all of these publishers now participating. A consequence that we've heard about many times from many library colleagues is that they're becoming overwhelmed. They're getting so many requests for money from so many people who are doing slightly different things with slightly different aims and slightly different mechanisms that it's just a bit of an overwhelming barrage. One of the consequences of this has been the proliferation of evaluation criteria. I'm sure some of our library colleagues know these, and perhaps some of our colleagues at the Open Book Collective, maybe the Open Library of Humanities, are familiar with these, but these are criteria lists against which a library can evaluate the requests for money that they've had from collective funding and other open access models. And this is completely understandable development. Libraries need to categorize, to be able to compare, to be able to make decisions that support them and their goals. Completely understandable, very reasonable. But these criteria do raise some problems from our perspective. The criteria are useful, but they can be very lengthy, and some of the questions that they ask can be quite difficult, particularly for smaller publishers. So, for example, many of the criteria have questions about impact and metrics that rely on good metadata, and some of the smaller publishers who are engaging in this maybe aren't at that stage yet where they can provide that information, and that must disadvantage them against larger publishers with better metadata. So that's one sort of issue. Another is that many of them ask about whether publishers are keeping up to date with accessibility guidelines. And while obviously it is important to keep as up to date with those as you can as a publisher, this can be really difficult as well for some of the smaller publishers who are having to adapt quite quickly to fast-moving guidelines. So sometimes we fear that the criteria may disadvantage some smaller scholarly publishers. We also have a question that actually, Sarah, you answered this morning to an extent, which is something that we worry about is, are all kinds of deals held to these very high standards? At York they are, but I would love to hear from other librarians later, if you use evaluation criteria, who do they get applied to? Because, for example, is a read and publish deal also evaluated on whether it is DRM free, or if it gives libraries a role in the governance of the initiative, or if it uses open infrastructure? Because these are very common questions that come to us. Is everyone being asked to do the same sort of good thing that these are? And if they're not, is that particularly fair? So yeah, this proliferation of collective funding offers has perhaps progressed to this sort of kind of professionalization. The evaluation criteria are one outlet, but there's one other one that I would also like to talk about quite briefly. So one of the things that the evaluation criteria ask for a lot is something that actually Jill pointed to this morning in her slides, which is, are you cited with a trusted vendor? So are you on a platform that we recognize? Do you use a billing agent that we trust? Which is what Jill was talking about with Lyrasis. And so this is something that is very important for collective funding, to be able to be on these platforms, to be available to purchase in that way easily by librarians. And in the UK, at least, we have had some issues with that I would like to sort of briefly talk through, because, again, I think that they are perhaps more broadly relevant. So due to there being now so many offers, and also due to the financial pressures across the higher education sort of sector, not just at HEIs, but at sort of more peripheral organizations, this has impacted us recently, although with a happy ending, which I will also focus on, which is that we had an issue late last year with JISC being able to host us. And so we're a UK-based thing. Can't really call us an organization because we're not quite as embodied as that, but we're a UK thing and we support some UK publishers. UK libraries are really important for us. But due to some changes to how JISC was supporting open access authors, we fell below a viability threshold with JISC to still be listed with them. And so this would potentially cause us some pretty catastrophic issues. And I think it has also impacted some other initiatives. But what I would also really like to emphasize, and not just because they're in the room today, is that our colleagues at JISC sort of have approached this with us as a problem to be solved. And with the aid of Lyrasis, we have found a slightly acrobatic workaround where we can still be listed on JISC, which, as I mentioned, is absolutely vital to us. And so that's great. We're incredibly grateful. We need to buy a couple of people drinks later about that, and that's great. But one thing that I keep thinking about is, yes, we found a solution with them, or rather they found a solution with us. But why did that happen? It partly happened because we've already had a long and productive relationship with them. We have a strong relationship of trust with our colleagues at JISC. They have a strong degree of trust in our thing because it's been going for a few years. And I can't help but wonder what would happen if we hadn't already had that lengthy relationship of trust with them. What if there was not that reason to find a workaround? And I guess what I'm curious about, and this sort of goes to the last session tomorrow, which is about where are the small scholar-led initiatives? When I think about this from a purely financial perspective, I think about some of these things. I think about the fact that I wonder how would a small, let's say UK-based scholarly initiative get going with collective funding in 2026? Would it be more difficult for them to do so now than it would have been a few years ago because of this professionalization of the field? Would they be able to keep up with the evaluation criteria or requirements about, let's say, metadata or impact? Would they be able to get listed on JISC? And so while there are a lot of benefits to the professionalization that we've seen, like workflows are easier, people are more aware of what we're doing, I worry that in some ways it's kind of leaving out some of its smaller sort of scholar-led roots. And I think, to take it back to what Yannicka was saying this morning, that's something that we should probably be quite concerned about. Anyway, that's the end of my monologue section of this talk, and we will now go back into a more proper Q&A. But I would really love later on to hear the perspective of some of the librarians in the audience and online about what I've just said.
Thank you, Kira. No, that's great. We enjoyed your monologue. I actually wonder, just before we go to our next kind of final question, Pete, for the library perspective, have you got any comments you want to make on the basis of some of what Kira's raised? Is it getting harder for libraries to engage?
Well, I suppose that there's an interesting tension in what we're talking about here, isn't there? In that kind of libraries, certainly on the procurement acquisition side, like standardization, and they like trusted suppliers and all of these things. So the mechanisms via which you can do it are getting easier on the library side, but it's interesting in the light of what Kira says, whether that's what the kind of blowback that is on the publisher side. The problems with finding money to support it are not so much technical ones, they're ones of just the availability of the funds, I think, increasingly at the moment. But I think there's always this tension in librarianship with our love of standardization and how much that actually stops innovation or kind of excludes anything that's a bit different. And that applies in this space here, but also talking about kind of diversity and inclusion in other spaces. I think it kind of blows back there as well.
Thanks, Pete. Oop. Thanks, Pete. Kat, do you want to mention anything about small publishers competing in this space, or you want to talk about that a bit later?
I can. I mean, we are a fairly small publisher. We are planning to publish 60 books next year, but in the past there's only been 20 or so. And opening the future has been very important to us. I mean, I can talk a little bit about, apart from all the administrative difficulties that Kira has mentioned, what I think from a small publisher's perspective, the most important thing that we don't necessarily have is time to engage with everything around the model. So with the libraries, with other publishers that might work in a similar space. So I think that's the biggest constraint, whereas the model itself is fairly straightforward. You don't need anything complicated to administer the model. You don't need an infrastructure because it's a package of ebooks and an acquisition workflow. So it should fit into what everyone already has. So you don't need to reinvent the wheel in that sense. But the outreach obviously takes time. The recognition, you need to talk to your commissioning editors because they need to talk to their authors as well and explain the model. So it's a very long tail that follows. It's easy to say, we're going to do this, but then you need to think about all of the other spiderweb parts that you need to cover. This goes as far as including your finance department, because we have a 3-year supporter base. And if someone prepays, how do you account for the money? Is it open access funding? Is it acquisition money? That's a decision that the publisher also has to take and the finance department has to understand. So we have in the beginning, had a lot of complicated discussions with our finance team to say, look, this is what this is. You need to understand what we're trying to do here and what the impact is, i.e., financing future books that might not even exist yet. So there's a lot of administrative stuff that needs to be dealt with. It needs to be dealt with before you can successfully go out there. We've been in the luxurious position of working with Tom and Kira for the last 5 years, so I can't possibly say whether it is easy for a new publisher to start. We had a lot of help and we're extremely grateful for it, but we will be going alone from April onwards, but we've been able to prepare for this eventuality. So I think we're in a good spot. What would be great for other small publishers is, I think, a community of practice or a network that we can talk to, because we all have the same experiences. And what we don't want to do is talk to the librarians in a slightly different way that maybe contradicts what someone else is doing and then unravels the whole process or the whole attempt, which is, in the end, we all want to make content open access. We want to help our authors get their research out there, and everything else is really secondary.
Thank you, Kat. I've often you mentioned there briefly about front list support and having to talk to libraries about it and doing the outreach. I've often wondered, and this is a question for later, maybe for all of you, but why we don't talk about open access funding for books a little bit like we do like a journal subscription. So you don't know what articles are going to be published next year by a journal you subscribe to, but you subscribe to them on faith that you know that their back content's great, so the front list is going to be good. I kind of wonder why we don't do that more with open access books and just say, I guess that's the premise that open book publishers and Punctum were based on. They're like kind of like we believe our front list content will be worth it, but we're asking you to make a leap of faith in advance and publishers up front, funders up front. But that's a question for maybe for a discussion later. I'd like to bring Pete back in, if I may, with another question, because you mentioned very briefly there about, there's not enough money to go around. So I wanted to go into a bit more detail on that because everyone in the room kind of failed to notice the recent announcements of several universities dropping their big deals with Elsevier and others of the big five. Well, you clap, but many of my colleagues on Copim are split about that because some of my colleagues say it's not great because it's not based on a strategic decision. It's based because financially those universities are going through a tough time, so they're having to make savings. Personally, I'll take the savings where we can get them. But I understand my colleague's position saying it needs to be a strategic divestment. Anyway, Pete, I wondered if you could talk a bit more about all of that from the library perspective, please.
Yeah, so it was really interesting that you began in your opening by kind of taking us back to 2020, because I think like my time at Sheffield was pretty much, in the content collections role, was kind of 2020 up until November of last year when I left. I think when we started out, this is very much my perspective. I can see there's colleagues from Sheffield on the line, and I think there's some others in the room, so they can dispute this. But so this is my perspective on what happened. That you could see kind of on the overall balance of library budgets, that so much of the money was being kind of swallowed up by these big deals. And I think very much the plan was, if possible, to divest ourselves from spending money in the wrong places and start spending money in the right places. And that was based on the idea that you know, broadly the library had autonomy to kind of spend its money in certain places. And I think the places that were successful in investing in open access books and open access infrastructure more generally, I think were probably the result of kind of a number of factors. So you had people who kind of cared about it enough at the institutions, all the way up to kind of directors of libraries who could be blockers. You had enough financial autonomy to allow you to kind of repurpose your budget in those ways. Or you could do, what you in the past, Tom, referred to as find the back of the sofa money that you can invest in these things. There are lots of ad hoc ways of doing that. And I think I felt that kind of what we wanted, and kind of again touching on your early point, was to kind of drive towards it being seen as an integral part of our work and strategic, and kind of get it embedded in policies like that. And I think everything was sort of going in the right direction. But the kind of looming wider crisis certainly in the UK HE, but I think in HE and other places as well, around funding kind of came into place. So that, and the other thing I should say, there was lots of grounding work in that period, certainly in the UK, to plan what a walk away from a journal big deal might look like and prepare lots of other things to do that. So we had all these coping strategies and all these ways that we might free up money. But I think then when push came to shove, though many institutions that had to kind of leave big deals, that the impetus was much more coming from the fact that the institution wanted them to make savings, so that the money you save was not then free to invest and let many flowers bloom in the open access space. It was in some, handed back to the university. And I think that, like the big risk always was that this kind of spending was conceived of as like a kind of nice to have, or a kind of form of, petty altruism, that you would just do it because it felt like the right thing to do. The argument was, and I think this has been made more powerfully elsewhere. I know, like the RO UK group who looked at this talked about kind of strategic altruism and how you invest money. The big idea is there's an unsustainability of the current commercial setup. So we need to kind of invest in the alternative for it to be available. So it kind of leaves us at this point in time where I think a lot of the kind of gains we've made in these places is at risk. And I don't think it's become embedded enough in strategy in various places. So I think there's a kind of pinch point here where you could be forlorn, or you could think that what kind of many of these institutions that are leaving their big journal deals are proving is like the sustainability of commercial publishing just isn't there. And one by one, as they trickle away, there'll be a recalibration of the sector. And I suppose from my point of view, wanting to see open access and open access monographs succeed, we need to ensure that all these alternative venues are in place. So that's, that's my summary of the last 6 years. I'd just be interested to know, others' thoughts, or how it kind of looks like more from the publisher perspective.
Thanks, Pete. Yeah, we've got a few librarians online, so I would hope people will be taking to the chat and pitching in there. It'll be interesting to see what comments come up. You touched on the word sustainability there, which is like a trigger word for a lot of us in the project. So again, another talking point that maybe we could talk about once we've finished our Q&A between us. But pretty much, if you're involved in open access revenue models, so like ours, or like the OBC, or our colleagues at OAPEN, all of those, as soon as you mention what you're doing for a living, the first question you get is, oh, that's nice, but is it sustainable? And I'm just so sick of hearing it, because, as Pete said, you could argue that the current system isn't sustainable in many ways as well, like 1.06 billion in APCs alone over 4 years, going to 5 publishers. That's not sustainable as far as I'm concerned, but you may think otherwise. Anyway, that's just my little rant in between. But I would like to return to that if we have time. But first, Kat, I have a question for you that does follow that discussion. So this one's a bit contentious. Some of the criticism of some of the collective programs that have launched since 2020, sometimes including ours actually, has been that some of these new revenue streams are just there to prop up publishers who aren't willing to change in good faith. They're not there to bring about meaningful change in their business practices. So I kind of wanted to hear a little bit from you about pragmatism from the perspective of a very small, quite niche publisher?
Thank you. I mean, we are definitely, as I said before, small and niche. So trying to find libraries to support our content we have to be very targeted in what we do. So we use Opening the Future because it helps us to make more content open access. It feels fairly straightforward, but because we publish on Central and Eastern European history, politics, so there's a lot of crossover into the modern world, and we just think that peer-reviewed academic research, which in the humanities is a lot more accessible than astrophysics, for example. You can pick up a monograph in history and vaguely know what's going on, and you can learn something from it and then apply that to your own critical thinking, and maybe, consider that the regime that you are living under or the government that you're living under might not be doing what it should be doing. So critical thinking is very much endangered, and I think we've heard that before as well. Academic freedom is on the line. So we want open access so that no one can have the power to say, no, you can't read this. And for our authors, that is very important. Being published open access through Opening the Future has become a badge of honor for our authors, because they know that the librarians and the institutions are pitching in and help to make their research open access. And they really want to produce the good work that will benefit from that. So we have a set of, granted slightly mobile criteria on what we allocate funding to, because we always have to see what is in the pipeline. But we definitely use it as a commissioning tool. We have to start with the discussion about open access quite early. It's not something that you can spring on the author just before the book gets published. So we say, we have some funding potentially, what do you have as a manuscript, and how can we make the best of it? So it's not just a funding tool for us, it's also a commissioning tool, and it is definitely something that has helped us to grow our profile. So we are, as I said, niche in subject, but I think we do a lot of shouting about Opening the Future, and that has helped to raise the profile both with the academics and the libraries. And it has definitely helped us to publish more widely, more internationally, also authors that come from regions or institutions that do not have any funding. So it's very egalitarian, and we like that. So it's, for us, it's been a really, really good thing. It's helped us to grow and to continue going. I mean, yes, there is a financial aspect to it that no one wants to talk about, but it doesn't prop us up as such, because if a book doesn't go open access, we can still sell it. But it is definitely something that has helped us to continue over the last few years in the difficult times.
We lost Pete. Oh no, he's there. Sorry, I just saw the camera moving. It's tracking us as we move. Thanks, Kat. So I'm going to come to you again, actually, before we bring in the other colleagues as well. I just kind of wanted to bring out a point. You mentioned about being quite niche in a way, but you also mentioned, humanities and social sciences. But from your perspective, some of the topics you publish are criticise certain political regimes, for example, and that kind of content might be easy to be struck off the purchasing lists first in some areas, potentially. I wonder if you could just say a little bit about that.
That is definitely true. I mean, HSS seems to be first on any list that is from must-have into nice-to-have or potentially not have at all. So again, if titles are open access, then they are there and you don't need permission to buy them. For the authors, it is the same vein, though. So they need to be potentially cautious in what they can publish, what furthers their career or what destroys their career, because they might say something critical. So we as publishers have to do our bit as well to help them overcome that potential for self-censorship as well. So we can help them to choose maybe a less contentious title, or, mess with the metadata, not mess with the metadata, adjust the metadata in a way that avoids certain trigger words. So there's an expertise that we have from 30 years of working within a difficult environment. So the CEU press was removed from Hungary in 2019, I think, because it was critical to the regime there. So we know what it's like to be, I don't want to be grandiose, but, a beacon of democracy and resistance in certain ways as well. But we have experience in working in this kind of environment. And yes, there are budget cuts, and yes, people are getting encouraged to maybe publish something different, but we're doing our bit against that. And I think open access as an act of resistance is something that we need to cling on to.
Thanks, Kat.
Yeah, I'm here. Pete, I do have a prepared question for you, but I don't know if you had any following comments there from Kat's points.
Well, what I wanted to try and do is like weave together things that kind of all three of you have said, because I think away from open access publishing, the price rises you get from commercial publishers are often used to justify keeping them in business, essentially. So the argument about kind of propping up publishers is true, but it's as true in the commercial space as it is in the other one. And I suppose to kind of the issue is it's kind of to Kira's point of are open access publishers held to different standards? The answer is you are, because in most cases, or certainly in my experience, the pot of money that pays for open access publishing is not as deeply embedded and ingrained in library workflows as the traditional subscription budget. And something you mentioned, Tom, about talking about thinking about kind of books and front lists as subscriptions. Well, again, in the commercial space, many publishers are no longer interested in selling as individual title by title requests and just want to sell as big collections of ebooks. So the whole thing is kind of weirdly coalescing, but it's a bit of a mess. And the fact is, because commercial publishers have the high ground in some ways and have embedded themselves in teaching and that, those are considered must-haves, whereas the kind of stuff Kat was talking about is still considered nice to have. And the big flip we need to do is that investing in this should be a fundamental core part of what a research library is up to. But that is very, very difficult to achieve within a kind of marketized, institution that is competing with other similar institutions and is trying to keep its costs down as much as possible.
Actually, I'm going to pick on you again, Pete, just to expand on one bit there, because your experience at Sheffield, you did carve out an OA budget. And I know we've got colleagues from Sussex here and maybe some other colleagues online at the university libraries that have managed to do the same. But I wonder if I could pick on you just to give a very quick case study on how you managed to do that at Sheffield, how you managed to ring fence a pot of money that in theory is protected and in theory can only be used for open access stuff.
So number one, we decided we wanted to do it, right? Which might sound obvious, but we decided that was an important thing to do. Two, we baked it into a content strategy, and then we took that content strategy as high as we could take it in the university. So even if they didn't fully understand the implications of what they were saying, we had a ratified document that said the transformation of academic publishing is an objective of the library. And then I suppose the elephant in the room was, at the time that we did it, there was a slight surplus in the budget that we could kind of take this. So yeah, traditionally, certainly at Sheffield, but this is true in lots of places, you would kind of underspend on your budget throughout the year and have some money left at the end of the year, in which you would make, end of year purchases. That was quite a common thing in library budgets. And you could use that to buy new paywall content for your specific collection, but we kind of made the strategic decision to spend it elsewhere. But so I'm thinking about this a lot now as I've moved institutions, and I've moved to an institution with a kind of different focus, is how much is the trick repeatable? And it will be more difficult in the future.
Thank you. Thanks, Pete. I guess, the planets have to align, right? And how you get them to align will be different at each university. Of course, we heard from Sarah as well this morning at York, doing it in a different way again. That would be something that topic would be great if we could come back to that in the Q&A, which we're going to get to very shortly. I do have one last prepared question that is kind of for the panel, but it's definitely for everybody out there as well. Forgive me, it's a little bit wordy, but I'll get to it. So, back in the summer of 2024, you should all remember that Research England ran a public consultation to ask whether or not they should mandate open access publication of scholarly books as part of the next REF, the Research Excellence Framework exercise. If you were awake around then, you'll remember that there was quite a lot of public discourse about it, and Research England rode back from it and decided not to mandate it this time around, though at the moment they're still saying it's mandated from the 1st of January 2029, which I find very interesting that we're not talking about that more, because if I was a publisher with books in manuscript form right now, I'd think January 2029 is not that far away. So I'd probably want to be preparing my ducks right now. But that's another point. The question I kind of want to talk about was that there was a suggestion came out in an article by Anthony Cond at the Association of University Presses, who suggested, why not just across the board top slice QR funding? I think he suggested 0.6% of the entire UK QR funding. Just slice it off the top, because through a rough calculation, that 0.6%, which is approximately £13 million, would pay for all the scholarly monograph output in the UK, at least. Forgive me, colleagues outside the UK. I don't mean to be rude. It's just the context I understand the best, but it's a good case study. So if you were to top slice a chunk of basically government funding and just pay for everyone's books to go away from the start, what does that do? Does that screw over less research-intensive institutions? Does that make it more difficult for teaching focus? I don't know. I'm kind of throwing that question out to all of you. We don't have any other pre-prepared questions now, so I'd love to go to Q&A. But if anyone wants to respond to that one, first of all, that would be great. No hands. We can finish early and go for coffee. Oh, Sarah in the front, thank you.
That's a good question. I'm thinking what happened in Grady. Yeah, what was happening in that scenario is that money would inevitably go to the established legacy publishers operating goings per hand models, so dog but person charges in the main, and it would prevent people from needing stakes about it. So that would be my real concern about that. I'm sure that's rather simplistic, but I think that would.
Thank you. Yeah. Did everybody catch that? Sorry.
What are you doing? It's quite faint online. If you could repeat it for those online, it would be helpful.
Okay, is that definitely okay? Oh, is it the button on the tries? Make a bit squeak. Yeah, sucks. Okay, I'll try again. Is that better?
Oh, this is. Yeah, I can hear it better. Yes. Yeah.
It's a.
Thanks. Yeah. Oh, that's obviously, yeah. So, yeah, I was just saying, I think what would happen in that situation is that inevitably the money made available would go disproportionately to the legacy book publishers, and it would be spent on BPCs, book processing charges. And I think it would really restrict the appetite, the curiosity, willingness to experiment from our academic side of things with other sorts of publishers who are offering different alternatives. So, and I say that from a little bit of experience we had, because we did experiment at York a few years ago with creating support for book processing charges, so moving that into our open access fund, in the hope that that would encourage people to look at other publishers. But inevitably all that happened was that the only people we had expressing an interest in that fund were for the likes of Routledge, CUP, etc., Bloomsbury. So yeah, it didn't highlight and showcase smaller publishers. So I think that would be the big danger there.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I mean, it feels to me like that would be heading down the route of OA at any cost, which, as we all know, has worked so well for journals. So probably not a great solution. But I just wanted to bring it up because I feel like Sarah's answer actually underlines the importance of diamond models, right? That kind of collective funding is probably the only way we're going to get there, I think. But anyone else want to pitch in on that, or should we just go to general Q&A?
Can I just say something like that?
Please do.
Hi. Yeah, so it's sort of again back to what Kira was saying about this sort of, what way about it, this kind of tension between the variety of models and the complexity that then produces for kind of procurement. So there's an attraction certainly on the library side in lots of OA areas to just things being done at a more definitively collective level. So like the funders producing money to kind of sort things out rather than dividing the money up, giving it to institutions and then asking individual institutions to make decisions either about which initiatives they support or which initiatives they don't like, that they walk away from. So there's an attraction on that side, but again, it's that kind of standardization involved. And if you have that, does that then mean you end up with a very kind of homogenous picture of what you get? And Sarah's point, I think, is the one that everything we know from the past is that money would be sort of lobbied into the hands of the people who've got money to pay for lobbyists, which are not currently open access publishers.
Yeah. Thank you. So have we got questions on the chat? Sue's nodding.
Yeah, I agree.
This thing added such things straight there, like you did.
Thanks. Can you hear me online? Yes, I think you probably can. So we have two different questions from online people. One goes back to what Kira was saying about the choice being easier. I think you made the comment about the choice being easier for authors. They would like to hear from the panel how an author can influence inclusion in collective funding models. So if you could talk about that. And the other one, so that's one of the questions. And then the other one is, does the central model of funding from UKRI cause issues for the collective models? They require library spends on diamond initiatives to be in the same financial year as publications of a relevant monograph. So a chicken and egg sort of effect. So there's two different questions there from online.
Thanks. Thank you. Kat and Kira, do you want to respond to the first question?
Okay. 10 years later. No, because I need to write dates.
Yeah, the authors absolutely can have an impact on the uptake of collective funding. This is something that we've heard anecdotally from librarians, that the views of their institutional researchers are important to some of the decisions that they make. So if a researcher will ask about a particular thing, then it's more likely to be considered. And that is something that when we've been strategizing, we've done sometimes, that we've asked authors to write to their libraries. And it can be kind of hard on a one-to-one basis track how that actually plays out. But yeah, from what we've heard from the library side is that they absolutely can have an influence.
And we try to do the same to get our authors to engage with the library on opening the future. So we speak to them during the commissioning process and say, look, when your book is published, please talk to your library. Here is even a form you can give them that says, I recommend opening the future, supporting opening the future. And we also go to academic conferences where we speak to the academics themselves, where we have information for them that is tailored to an academic for opening the future and why they can benefit. So we try and close that loop as well. I mean, quite frankly, I don't know what the pull-through rate is because we don't get very much feedback on that process. But I'm hoping that there's a whole network of academics talking to you guys behind our backs. Obviously, only good things.
Thank you. So the second question was about UKRI's funding, which, just to recap, because I'm not quite sure I'm sure of it, but UKRI have a pot of money put aside to fund scholarly books. There's like a 3-step process. You can apply for that funding. And does their funding make it more difficult for libraries to engage with collective models? I'm actually going to be really mean, and I'm going to get 2 of my colleagues to answer this. And it's either Rupert or Graham who are here. Whoever Caroline, do you want to answer this? No. Basically, Graham helped to frame some of the policy, and Rupert has thoughts, but
Graham probably knows better than I do. Then I know that the UKRI changed their block grant open access terms and conditions in, I want to say, June, July 2025. Interestingly, a couple of months after we had the N8 statement from the Northern Universities on equitable scholarly publishing, which may have contributed to the change. But essentially what it meant was that they included a specific reference to the being able to spend on collective library funding, so library membership schemes. And even though they maintained that that had been prior to that statement and that update, a lot of librarians telling us that their finance officers were rejecting those when they tried to cite, open book publishers or something, get rejected by the finance team. So it actually made a huge difference to us when those T's and C's were changed. And I believe that Wellcome did it in 2025 as well.
Thanks, Caroline. I think there was a nuance to the question as well, which was about the money having to be spent in the same year, which, like collective models tend to be year-on-year spend, right? We want libraries to invest year on year. It's not just a one-off. So that is probably a question that somebody else is better placed to answer. I don't know if there's anyone in the room or online can talk about that.
I mean, the basic problem is UKRI money comes with lots of caveats attached to it, and a lot of people are funding both their transformational agreements, but also this kind of activity from parts or all are funded by the UKRI block grant. So as it adds to the question, it kind of the complexity of UKRI policy does make it difficult to invest in these things, particularly if you're predominantly relying on UKRI money rather than the library content budget to do it.
Sure, thank you.
Areas, I think, you're most specific in the monographs fund.
Right, okay, thanks. Are there any more questions on further topics?
Okay,
So, Tom, you did give me the opportunity, so I may as well take it. I think also just, Caroline's point, I think, is absolutely critical. I think some libraries have been able to use the UKRI funding to be able to initiate some library spend in for the collective funding. And we heard earlier in the day that initiating a funding route initiates a discussion. And so, okay, it's not necessarily guaranteeing funding in perpetuity, but it is getting that initial discussion into the library room. We are now sponsoring this, and then do we continue it? But we've got the money to do it. So I think it's potentially a very important, I think the term was soft money, but it's a soft money route into bringing that discussion in for some libraries anyway, maybe.
Graham.
So I have my name mentioned, so I should speak, and I'm always in agreement with Rupert. I actually am. So I should say so. Graham Stone, OAPEN Foundation in the Netherlands. So I may have worked on the UKRI policy, but I have to say any comment I say by saying I no longer live or work in the UK, and I had no idea that anything had changed in 2025 because I left in 2024. But I was actually going to virtually say the same thing as Rupert. The policy is potentially deeply flawed, as many policies are, but it did open a door. And from the sort of back end of things, that was the intention, is how can the policy support bibliodiversity? How can it support things? And you can agree or disagree with how it's worked, and clearly if UKRI are interested in changing that within the life cycle of the policy, they're listening and they're doing things. But I think that the important point is it was the first one. There weren't any other policies from funders. Wellcome being an important difference there, but most of the funding from the funders around Europe were for BPCs. There were BPC pots, and the UKRI policy had a specific bit in it that would support Diamond. So, like I say, I don't have to say this because I'm not in the UK anymore, but I think it should be congratulated on that because it did something. And I had funders talking to me from around Europe saying, how did you do that? Because it was too difficult for us. They're now considering it, and I think things are moving. So I completely agree. It's opened the door for this to happen. And, you know, I hope to see a revised policy. I hope to see policies from other funders, and I should put a shout out to the Palmyra project, which finished just over a year ago, that was looking at that throughout the European research area, as well as how can we align this and how can we get this kind of thing into policy. So it started the conversation, but it's early days, and we know this is monograph publishing, and we could still be here in 10 years. Some of us have already been here 15, but the changes are getting there, and they're going faster.
Thank you.
I think we've got time for one more question. I'd quite like for us to finish so that we can have the next session start on time. Do we have one more fresh question, either online or in the room?
Yeah, I would say.
Oh, Siobhan, you've got your hand up. Thank you.
No one else has one. I guess I have one for Kira and Peter. It's around the mention of metrics, and I'm sure Kira knows exactly where I'm about to go. Sorry, it's about metrics. I'm sure Kira knows what I'm about to ask, but I do wonder about Peter's opinion. So I would question to you, and I wonder if you would agree or disagree with me, whether it's productive at all when we talk about ranking or sort of about ranking, assessing open initiatives to look at impact and metrics as all, such as the journal impact factor or a Scopus ranking and all those other ones. Or like any of the other indexing platforms, because so many of them either heavily favor the big commercial models or just downright ignore or even discriminate against open access models, depending on how ideologically far you wish to go, which I've only really found out after I started working on it. This was a very fun discovery, because they are effectively measured by and for and paid and provided and developed by and for the very organizations and quite often companies that we are ideologically diametrically opposed to. Like, I wonder, is this a master's tool kind of situation? Is it fair to say the master's tools can't take down the master's house? And are we trying to, in a way, limit ourselves by trying to do so? And because I know from a library point of view, until I had to start the publishing site, we use it for discovery. But is it then productive at us at all from a library acquisitions point of view to use those tools, which can be quite harmful to small-scale open access outfits, to measure and buy it? Are we inadvertently cutting ourselves in, well, not just the nose, I think the fingers and the hands at this point? There might be an organ involved. Thank you, Siobhan.
Does anyone have anything they'd like to respond there?
I do have a quick one.
Oh, sorry, Kerry, you go first.
Oh, yeah, sorry, I have a quick answer because I think Pete's is probably more expansive and useful. But yeah, the impact factors, particularly that kind of thing for journals, especially, like, you can game them horribly. I hate them. I think they're sort of useless. So I hate them. But you actually reminded me of another issue of the evaluation criteria that I wanted to mention, was a lot of them are generically for open access, which means that sometimes books are asked to provide information that is maybe more journal focused, and that can also be really difficult for us. But yeah, I don't like those kinds of factors. They're a bit of a joke, but Pete may respect them slightly more than me coming from a library perspective.
I don't respect them at all, personally, but the issue is, so everything Siobhan said is, it is correct, and those are the problems with them. The problem is that you, as a librarian, you live within an institution that takes these kind of things seriously. So this is evidence that might move the needle and might allow you to invest in something that you otherwise couldn't invest in. So you're kind of trapped in this position of, on a philosophical level, I don't think they make much sense, and they are clearly a barrier to innovation and diversity and loads of things like that. But many institutions have, getting published in high-ranking journals and lots of things, on the book side, in prestigious publishers and things like that in there. So it's a problem, like many things, is that you've kind of got to speak in the language that will make sense, and you've got to kind of lobby outside of that to try and get rid of them. But I accept then you're in a weird situation of the more you kind of support and endorse them, the more that undermines your ability to lobby against them. But it's kind of, it's a bit like, why did lots of libraries sign up for those transformational agreements? Because they're not the ultimate decision makers in their institutions. And that's the weird space a librarian sits in, that you can often you can see all the problems, but the kind of structural factors and your ability to kind of undermine those are tough. So that's a bit of a full-on answer, right?
Brilliant. Thank you, Pete. That's probably a good point at which to stop. We've got 1 minute to spare, so I'm just going to very quickly say thank you to all our speakers, and thank you to everyone who's pitched in with questions. I can see the chat's going off, so clearly there's more to talk about here. It would be great if any of you on the chat or on in the room come and grab us, messages, whatever. Happy to continue this discussion long into the night. Thank you, everybody, for listening. We're going to call it quits. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
That's